So let's get going. Lewis Raven Wallace is an award-winning independent journalist based in Durham, North Carolina. He is the author and creator of the View from Somewhere book and podcast, and a Ford Global Fellow and Abolition Journalism Fellow with Interrupting Criminalization. He previously worked in public radio and is a longtime activist engaged in prison abolition, racial justice, and queer and trans liberation, and a co-founder of many organizations, including Press On and the Chicago Childcare Collective. He is white and transgender and was born and raised in the Midwest with deep roots in the South. His forthcoming book from Beacon Press is called Radical Unlearning: The Art and Science of Creating Change from Within. So welcome, Lewis. Welcome to Arizona.
Thank you, Kathy. Hi, Arizona. Thanks so
Yeah,
much for having me.
yeah, let me just spotlight. Actually, in or no, I'm getting it. Add spotlight. There we go. Sorry, it's hard to do two things at once. So, Lewis, can you, let's get started. Can you tell us a little bit about your past and your current work and the journey that brings you to the here and now? I always love to hear about people's personal journeys. They are always surprising. So, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what brings you here?
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up, as my bio mentioned, in the Midwest. I grew up in a college town in Michigan, Ann Arbor, and I was really politicized in the late 90s and early 2000s by the experience of coming out as queer and then as trans. And I like to situate that for people by saying, I came out as gay the year that Ellen DeGeneres came out. So that was kind of the that moment in 1996 when there were very few examples of kind of out gay people in the mainstream. And I came out as trans the year that a film called Boys Don't Cry came out, which is a Hollywood film that was kind of the first Hollywood treatment of uh, really of a trans person who was represented as a trans person. And it was a movie about a real person based on a real story of Brandon Tina, who was a trans masculine person who had been really brutally murdered and in a small town. And that was, I remember going and seeing that movie actually in the theater in Ann Arbor and being like, wow, this is the first time that I felt like I saw myself reflected. And then, of course, it's a very violent movie with sexual assault and murder. And it also turned out, as I later learned about that history, that the fictionalized Hollywood kind of version of Brandon Tina's story, that was his name, Brandon Tina, had removed some really key details, including another person who was murdered at the same time as him, who was both black and disabled, who didn't appear in that movie as a character at all. And then later, even further kind of unpacking that, I learned that when Brandon Tina's story had first been covered in the early 90s in the Village Voice, so covered by, media from outside of where he lived, the writer for the Village Voice basically assumed that he was a lesbian and understood him to have been like a masculine woman and told the story as the story of a masculine woman trying to survive by presenting himself as male. And in the early 90s, when that happened, trans activists, there was like a very small but powerful group of them in New York had actually protested, written to the Village Voice and protested at the Village Voice and said, you need to correct the record. This was a trans person. So all that is to say, there was very little kind of in the mainstream media about people that I could identify with. And so I was part of really a grassroots, very grassroots kind of youth movement of trans and queer youth. And at the time, we used the word genderqueer. Now people say non-binary, but that was before there was that terminology. And they them pronouns were also not really a thing. So we were like, let's try these different pronouns. Let's try Z and C and three and per and all these words that we were experimenting with. And we communicated these ideas through zines and through kind of very DIY forms of media. And then in the middle of all that, the internet kind of came up, right? And I always knew that I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know until quite a while later that I wanted to be or could be a journalist. And so to fast forward just a little bit, I was an activist for a long time. I worked in coffee shops. I worked in a women-owned feminist sex toy store, a kind of a famous one called Good Vibrations in California for a few years. Um, and, kind of bopped around and eventually went to college and all this stuff. And I got involved with letter writing with queer and trans people who were in prison. And as I was communicating with people who were incarcerated, and I'd come up as an activist and gotten a lot of trouble for sort of doing what I did. But overall, I would say I came from a very privileged kind of background, right? Like white, upper middle class, in this kind of educated elite community in Ann Arbor. And so I'd had very little interaction with people who were really in the lived daily experience of the prison system. And through communicating with people who are queer and trans behind bars, I became very politicized around prisons and got interested in, what are alternatives, what are other ways of thinking about harm and violence that really name the harm and violence of the state and of policing and of racism and move away from responding to problems in community by incarcerating people. And so through that, I became an abolitionist and kind of joined the movement for prison and police abolition in the 2000s. In the late 2000s, I started doing storytelling work around policing and prisons through an organization in Chicago called Project NIA. The mission of Project NIA was to end youth incarceration in the state of Illinois. And Project NIA was led by a Black feminist activist named Miriam Kaba, who was a mentor to me and really kind of took me under her wing. And as I was working with her, we were documenting the stories of young people's encounters with police in Chicago, focused on young people of color and queer and trans young people who are often profiled and targeted by police just for how they looked, for their identities, for sort of where they hung out, hanging out on certain street corners or in certain areas. And we were telling those stories and recording them in audio format. And I got really excited about making audio stories and ended up applying for and getting a fellowship at the public radio station in Chicago, WBEZ, that at the time had a really amazing program for community activists to come into the radio station, learn how to make radio stories, and then bring that knowledge back to our communities. And so my kind of vision at the time was like, actually based on this idea that radio can cross prison walls, and it's one of the ways that people inside prison, at least at the time, could get information in a sort of an accessible, low-cost way was by listening to actual radios, physical radios. And so I was like, if I learn to make radio, we can do prison radio and all this stuff, and I can Skillshare and all these things. And I went into the radio station, and I was like exposed to all these daily news journalists, and I thought this was the coolest thing ever. And I want to do this, I really want to be a radio person. And so I ended up kind of getting sucked into working as a journalist.
Mm.
Because at the time I didn't really have a career path per se, right? I was like bopping along where, doing activism and trying to figure it out. And so I stayed in public media, public radio for about 5 years and loved it, got really great at it, started working at first in local radio covering the economy and the environment, and then in national radio. And then that kind of brings me up to the point of where in 2017 I was fired from my job in national radio for political reasons. And that led to me kind of coming full circle and doing the thing I had originally set out to do, which is really more about transforming how we tell stories and putting the tools of storytelling as much as possible into the hands of people who are directly impacted by systems of violence and incarceration. And that's what I do now. So I'll stop there because I know we're going to get lots of more details, but that's a little bit about where I'm coming from.
I just love sort of evolutionary stories of how we become who we are and how we are always becoming, and if our minds are open to new experiences and new ideas, we can continue to grow and evolve and become even more of who we are. I love stories of the paths that people take. Thank you. So, to sort of progress into, I came across your work when I was researching a new training that we are going to be doing here in Arizona. Actually, our first date is in a couple of weeks. We do a lot of online trainings, and it's on media literacy. And the rabbit hole that I started going down was about objectivity in media. And I immediately stumbled across your writing, which utterly fascinated me, and it opened a perspective to me that I hadn't really thought deeply about. Um, so your first book, The View from Somewhere, is subtitled Undoing the Myth of Journalistic Objectivity. So what is that myth? And is there a difference between, oh, I don't know, objectivity, neutrality, impartiality, that whole sort of family of synonyms?
Yeah, sure. So the story behind The View from Somewhere began, well, really, it began back where I just started, but it began for real when I was working in national media for a show called Marketplace, which is produced by American Public Media, during the 2016 election cycle, which I don't know if people remember was when Trump was first elected.
I remember.
And and the so when I came into public radio, it was almost like opposite day for me because I'd been in this world of activism that was really grounded in the idea that we tell our own stories and, the kind of disability justice framework of nothing about us without us. And this idea that, my lived experience is the place to sort of speak from. And I actually think that goes sort of deep into the roots of like feminist practice, consciousness raising groups, Black feminist practice, the intersectionality and sort of what we can learn from Black feminism about how racism and sexism and gender kind of intersect in people's daily lived experience. And so I came into the radio station thinking like, okay, great. I'm this, anti-prison activist. I'm a trans person. I'm going to like bring all that to bear on these stories I'm going to do. And then immediately I was told, okay, well, but we're objective, right? We're impartial. And I will get to the question of pulling these terms apart, right? But in this context, they are all used interchangeably. We're impartial, we're objective, we're neutral. And so, what you need to do is not do any stories that are about any of the things that you're connected to as an activist. And so it was kind of almost completely the opposite political ethos around storytelling. This idea that your credibility comes from not having a connection to the story and from being in some kind of identity sense outside of the story. And of course, that didn't make a lot of sense to me based on my lived experience because I think taking trans issues alone as sort of a lens for understanding that is very clear that mainstream media had, for my whole life, been very biased against trans people, right? And really the only people who were situated to correct the record on that were trans people. And so it would be difficult to kind of approach the issue of transness in a really transphobic context without having a bias like towards trans people and or being one, right? Understanding like, oh, we need to kind of correct the record. And I've heard a similar parallel kind of story many times from journalists who are Muslim, from journalists who are Black, of kind of coming into a newsroom and immediately being suspect, like you're automatically less credible if you're sort of um, tied to your community or an advocate for your community in these ways. And to me, it was ironic and strange that that same kind of scrutiny is never applied to people in a privileged position. So, cisgender people obviously have a bias around trans issues and around gender that maybe is less recognized or less acknowledged than the one that trans people have. But I think with these social kind of issues and identity issues, everyone brings bias. And so it didn't make a lot of sense to me, but I was like, I'm just going to go along with this. And there were a lot of rules. It was, you can't be an activist in any way. You can't have yard signs, bumper stickers. You can't be partisan, all these things. And I was like, that's fine. I want to be a journalist. I'm going to do this. And then when 2016, 2017 came around, and Trump was campaigning and using kind of increasingly racist rhetoric. And he's gotten way more into transphobic rhetoric in his second round. But even at the time, racist, transphobic rhetoric, anti-Muslim rhetoric, and kind of stoking violence and fear. And I felt really strongly from the perspective of inside of the newsroom, like, okay, we don't need to all become opinion writers, right? I really value the work of making daily news, but we do need to figure out a way to talk about this that isn't about just kind of avoiding seeming like we're biased. And that in that time period, there was a lot of very silly discussions about like Trump would lie and then NPR the next day would call it um, a misleading statement or a statement that could not be easily verified or something like that. So then Trump would say something racist, and NPR the next day would say, Trump used racially charged language, right? So there's this way of kind of giving a performance of objectivity that was very much a standard in these newsrooms. And so I wrote a blog post in right after Trump was inaugurated in 2017 that was titled Objectivity is Dead and I'm okay with it. And the argument of the blog post was basically, as journalists, we need a moral compass. We need to be able to look at lies, to look at rhetoric that is driven by transphobia and white supremacy, to look critically and speak honestly about all of these things. And the performance of objectivity isn't helping us to do that. It's not an argument for letting go of journalistic practices of verification or journalistic practices of like the standard of, you want to talk to more than one person, get more than one perspective, or fact check as much as possible. These things are good, and I'm not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? But how can we as journalists have a moral compass that says, okay, and we're not okay with authoritarianism. We're not okay with racism and white supremacy. We're not condoning that, and we're willing to name it. And it was over writing and publishing that blog post on my personal blog that I was fired. And after I got fired, I became very interested in the kind of vague knowledge that I had that, oh, I'm not the first person to raise this critique of media. And of course I wasn't. And there was a particularly long tradition among Black journalists and Black activists in also in academia and in journalism of criticizing objectivity as essentially a tool of gatekeeping, saying objectivity is itself ideological. It's a way to insist that people remain or present a sort of neutrality on other people's humanity and other people's oppression. And it's a harmful framework. And I bring up Black activists in particular because I want to really honor that. I think this is the critiquing objectivity was a long-standing Black feminist tradition that I kind of stumbled into from my lived experience and then got the opportunity to write a book about the myth of objectivity. Where did it come from? Why was it, how was it used to silence the voices of particularly racialized people, indigenous people, gay people, and trans people in journalism? And then how had that myth kind of shaped what we even think that journalism is in the United States? So even this discussion of like traditional journalism, I think leaves out a whole tradition of journalism that is abolitionist journalism that goes all the way back to the 1800s. So at the same time as organizations like the New York Times were being born, you had this really, really active and very radical anti-capitalist Black press talking, telling stories that were true, right? Telling stories that were journalistic and verified, but telling them from a stance that, and you said in the opening, Kathy, you said something that's exactly what one of the people I wrote about said, which is um, we are not a partisan organization, but that doesn't mean we're neutral. And that was a real tradition in the Black press, was not being partisan, not being aligned with a political party, but not being neutral on the humanity of Black people. And the same thing in sort of the later history of the gay press. So The View from Somewhere is a historical book about voices that have been silenced, marginalized, and pushed out of journalism on the basis of this kind of mythology that the only real journalists are the people who stand outside of the story.
Mhm. Yeah, and this is really sort of the heart of what fascinates me, the whole idea of objectivity and bringing diversity into a newsroom, for example, but then squashing it, saying you cannot express what makes you different. And that just seems so incredibly counter to, I mean, you use the word performative objectivity, and I think that describes it really well. Um, so what interests me, I mean, so many things about this interest me. So it's not just what is reported, but what is not reported. And I think it's a lot harder for us to see absence than it is to see presence. And part of the gatekeeping, as you were saying, is choosing which stories are important. Can you talk a bit about that and your experience in, whether it's in public radio or any of your other reporting or writing? Could you talk a bit around that?
I'm glad you brought that up because I think that is one of the most important kind of sites where the issue of nothing is neutral shows up,
Hmm.
right? Is that when I started working in newsrooms, coming from the outside, I had this experience of kind of you listen to the news, and I'm a big radio person, so I would listen and you hear the newscast in the morning, and that's kind of what's going on in the world. It shapes, it frames, which issues are we debating and thinking about, and which issues are kind of outside the realm of debate. And, the trans example again is a really good one of like for most of my life, honestly, and certainly most of my kind of coming of age time period and becoming a journalist time period, nobody talked about trans issues one way or the other. Nobody talked about this idea of binary gender, or breaking down the gender binary or gender ideology or any of these terms, right? It was just kind of outside the scope of being a story. And trans people are a very small community, and we were kind of, even those of us who are very out, like myself, we were kind of in that sense underground, ignored. And when I came into a newsroom context, I realized, oh, that newscast that I hear in the morning and just think is sort of the news of the day, some random, very small group of people, usually mostly white, often run by a cisgender man, is like just deciding earlier that very same day what's important and what's going to be in the newscast. And that really landed for me, really came home for me when I moved to Ohio and started working in a tiny, tiny little radio station. Within a few months, I'm coming in the morning I'm going through the Associated Press newswire and whatever other stories have been filed by other reporters the previous day, and I'm deciding what goes on the newscast. Not me and some other people, not me based on any metrics, but just Lewis deciding, right? And so, of course, it was very evident to me, like, wow, I could make anything be the news of the day, right? And whoever woke up even earlier that morning and wrote up the newswire, filed the newswire stories for the Associated Press, they had been the ones making those same decisions. And so who's in the room makes all the difference. And I really was in rooms where it was almost comical, like you would have an editor who are the people who decide. It's not usually the reporters. So an editor or some other senior producer or something say like, we really need to do a story about the flooding in the Chicago suburbs because I came in this morning and my yard was flooded. My backyard was flooded. Okay, like flooding is totally a story, right? Flooding in Chicago is way, way worse in the urban south side of Chicago than it ever is in the suburbs. But there could be a flood in the south side and it would never be a story on the radio that day because not a single editor at the radio station lived on the south side of Chicago. And so that's, and that's not even identity based, it's like geography, right? But also class and also race of like what makes the story of the day. And so my kind of experience of that really jolted me into kind of thinking, this is a lot of power, and what are other ways to think about this? And then I saw a really big shift in the newsroom where I worked in Ohio in 2014 after Michael Brown was killed and the Ferguson uprisings, because that was an instance of the kind of routine police abuse and violence towards Black people, unarmed Black people, particularly. It would happen and it wouldn't make the news. It would happen and it wouldn't make the news. It would happen and it wouldn't make the news. Then there was this uprising, there were all these protests, and there was a really deliberate insistence on the part of the Black Lives Matter movement that these stories be told, that they be researched and reviewed and retold, not just using the police press release that would say like, oops, officer involved shooting, we don't know what happened, moving on to the next thing. And I saw this real shift in the newsrooms I was working in from kind of passively repeating the police version of the story to actually researching the story. The really cool thing that I learned about historically in my research was Ida B. Wells, the famous Black journalist from Memphis who ended up being an activist in Chicago as well. She had essentially done the same kind of journalistic activism around the issue of lynching. So the way that we understand lynching today as this like horror that was based on lies, when lynchings were first routinely happening, they were being reported in the news as either not at all or sort of as like justified events, like oh, somebody did something and other people reacted. And then Ida B. Wells went and researched and reported all these stories of lynchings of Black men all over the country and found that most of the accusations that these white mobs had made against them had been false. And so our whole understanding of what lynchings were as a form of racial terror was really shaped by that kind of news judgment on the part of this Black woman who said, you know what, no, we need to cover this story more deeply. And so that's why, it really does matter who's in the room. And sometimes to change who's in the room, you have to be an activist. And Ida B. Wells knew that and just went and did it, right? And created, really kind of built the whole tradition of investigative journalism in this country through her advocacy as a journalist.
Mhm. Yeah, so you mentioned investigative journalism, and we're not talking about opinion writing, for example. And the media is really pretty careful to distinguish what is news and what is opinion. But in between those two things is supposed to be a judgment of what is important and also how to report it. And it is, I mean, I sort of think about objectivity in the sense that the New York Times, for example, they feel they're being objective, and in fact, they are bending over backwards to make a story. And I always say we're nonpartisan, but we're not bipartisan. That means we do have a point of view, and we are not giving equal time to the opposite point of view. However, a lot of news media seems to feel that objectivity is sort of the midpoint between two things. And I'm wondering, how do we work our way out of this? And as news readers, which I assume most of the people on the call are, how do we distinguish and how do we find sources that are giving us journalism that is, I don't know, what even is another word other than objective?
Yeah, so I think there are sort of two ways, maybe three ways that I think we can all be doing this. One of them, of course, is to go to sources and outlets that are openly espousing, here is what I stand for. For example, I write a lot for Truth Out, which is an openly abolitionist outlet, an outlet that's focused on movement building. And so when we publish a story at Truth Out, we're thinking of our audience as people who are also building progressive and radical left movements, and we're writing to that audience. And sometimes I write columns for them, sometimes I write reported pieces, but either way, you can actually be clear in your stance and in your framing. So that's one way, right, is to find the outlets that already exist. But I think uh, important and kind of underestimated strategy is a strategy of, particularly with our local media, media activism, telling them what you want. And the right wing has done a lot of that.
Yeah.
So when you work in a public radio station, especially a little one like I worked in Ohio, one person can call and be like, that story really upset me. And the next day, everyone in the newsroom is talking about that call, right? So imagine if five people called, or imagine if 10 people called or and said, I'm upset about this story, or I wish you would cover this, or whatever. You can actually change the decisions that are happening inside of newsrooms by complaining. And
You're
so
good at that.
I really like to tell people that because I think often we sort of receive the news in this passive way, like, I hated that, or that wasn't what I would have said, or they missed this, or whatever. But there's a person, just a regular person, and sometimes a really awesome person behind that story who like could have done better, wish that they knew, or their editor wouldn't let them do the story the way they wanted to. And so hearing from y'all, like, hey, we didn't like the framing of that story. And you can be, I mean, you can be vociferous in your advocacy, right? Like when I was inside of the newsroom, I would have to sort of say, like, hey, I think there maybe is a racial implication to this. Da, 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 da. But somebody from outside could call and be like, yo, that was a racist story.
Yeah.
People would be sensitive to that, like not always for the right reasons, but journalists are very sensitive to criticism and don't want to get things wrong and don't actually want to piss people off. And so, some institutions or journalists might have self-righteous reactions to that. The New York Times is a really good example, right? Like they have their own sort of power structure that I don't think is changeable by people from the outside of their complaining. But your
Mhm.
local media is probably a different story. And you don't have to be jerks about it. You can also reach out and get to know the reporters and feed them
Mhm.
stories and talk to them about things. But just know that they are people and that you can change the way that they report, what they choose to report, what they think is important, and how they frame things. And I
Mhm.
think that's a really, really worthwhile effort. So much of the kind of shift to the right in mainstream media has been because right-wing activists demanded it. They called and said like,
Yeah.
hey,
Right.
you're not being fair to us. You need to
Mhm.
air our point of view. You need to bring our people on. You need, and they've done that and done that and done that to the point that you have like these wacko transphobes and homophobes who don't represent most of the country being given these huge platforms, right? And then that has this weird sort of echo effect of making it seem like that's a very normal point of view. And then people adopt that point of view. And so their sort of theory of change, it really including and involving media activism has been extremely thorough and very strategic and very smart. And I don't want to replicate everything about that, but I do think that there's a lot of kind of untapped potential energy for activism around demanding the media that we want to see. The Black Lives Matter movement did that and has been very successful with changing the narrative about police shootings of unarmed Black people.
Mhm.
Um, that hasn't necessarily changed the conditions on the ground, and there's been a lot of backlash. But changing the narrative is something that has been done really, really powerfully by that movement, essentially pushing on media themselves. And then the one other thing I would say about this is that I'm all about make your own thing. And so, especially now as we're dealing with this rising authoritarianism and a increasing censorship and targeting of activists, we need our own communication channels where we can get across ideas, actions, information that may not be able to be communicated at all in sort of a larger news platform. So, building kind of our own informational infrastructure and ways of communicating. Some really good examples are like the ICE Watch kind of work that's going on, where
Yes.
people verify is ICE actually present in the community, and if not, let's dispel the rumor through this grassroots network. And if they are present, let's let everybody know. So that's kind of what I mean when I say information infrastructure. It doesn't have to be like you start a whole newspaper, but just using the access that we have to each other in community to fill the gaps that media at this point is not going to fill because so much of it is corporate owned by somebody a zillion miles away and the money is going to a hedge fund. So
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think we all, well, speaking for my generation, we are used to going to, some reliable news sources and getting the news and learning, the facts of the day, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on, I don't know, in LA. Without even sort of realizing that we're looking at it through you know, in a box, basically, and we're not seeing things outside of that box. And now it seems to me that, and part of our new media literacy training has to do with both media consolidation and media fragmentation, because both are happening at the same time. And the consolidation seems to be distorting the news that we actually get. And the fragmentation allows us to do, as you exactly say, picking up and filling in some of the cracks. So, and we actually call that grouping of trainings we do changing the narrative. So that you are speaking right to us. So, um, is it possible for any outlet, any single outlet, to have and I know that I hate the words fair and balanced, but um, it seems that there's a lot of self-censorship going on in the media. It's like, oh, we better not say that. It might get us in trouble, or um, and to me, it's like the media is trying to say, well, here's totalitarianism, here's democracy, you decide, which is which is right. So is there a way, I guess I'm sort of winding around to say, is there a way to actually cover the news in a holistic way that that also has what is it, a moral perspective? um, I guess I'm just sort of grasping for the shreds of the media. And is there any place I could go to get a holistic look at what's going on?
right. Yeah. And kind of I know that feeling of like, man, I want to know the news, right? And
Yes.
I live in Durham, North Carolina, in a place where there's very little in terms of resources for local news at all. And I would just really love to have more local news, right? And to have more of the
Yeah.
kind that I felt like I could trust. For me, what that would look like would be um, people who are rigorously practicing journalism in the sense of going out and talking to people, talking to as many people as possible, finding out what's happening, um, and then, really intentionally shaping stories to help our community make sense of our lived experience, help our community make meaning, and help our community make decisions. I think that, yes, honesty, I think, is really useful. I think transparency is a really useful value. Um, I don't think, like I said before, I don't think it all needs to be pieces or really centered on the reporter. I think the place of the greatest potential for this is our public media platforms. Honestly, there may be even more of an opening in that possibility because their big fear is being defunded by the federal government. Now they have been defunded by the federal government. And so they depend on us to fill the funding gap, donate to your public radio station, and then tell them what you want. That's like, I think, the number one strategy. And in an ironic way, I'm not happy about the federal defunding of public radio. Don't get me wrong. But
Yeah.
in a sort of bittersweet way, I think there's some opportunity there for community advocates and just community members to really take the public service element of that and push for the kinds of coverage that we want to see. Beyond that, I think building our own organizations is really the only
Mhm.
hope because the corporate consolidation has just been a death knell, right? And it was
Mhm.
already difficult, but a lot of those newspapers and outlets never covered marginalized and oppressed communities in
Mhm.
any kind of meaningful or accurate way. And now that's just getting worse and worse. And I don't know that it's worth putting a lot of energy into trying to, rearrange the deck chairs
Yeah.
on the sinking ship, which is again my feeling about the New York Times, et cetera.
Yeah.
But making our own things and the skills of journalism. This is like anathema in journalism schools because it's been, professionalized in such a way. But I think the skills of journalism are something that anyone can learn.
Mhm.
And some of the best journalists and best organizations that I know are people who had a vision, had a mission, and then decided we're going to build this ourselves. So organizations like the Kansas City Defender, which is a run by a very young, like teens and 20 something Black people in Kansas City that just saw a gap in the news coverage and were like, we're going to make our own paper, Kansas City Defender, and
Mhm.
they cover local news. They break stories all the time. When they're not breaking stories, they sort of translate stories that have been reported in the mainstream for like a young Black audience and put stuff on social media. And they're creative and they know their audience. And supporting efforts like that, I think, is another really important piece. Efforts that might not seem for people who are maybe more accustomed to certain traditions of mainstream journalism that might not seem like the journalism that we know from before, right? But it actually is, I think, the journalism of the future.
Mhm. Yeah, I do agree with definitely with a lot of that. I am, oh golly, I just lost my train of thought. Um, so are there any generally understood values that are underpinning journalism that would supersede that myth of objectivity, like racial equity, like human rights, like free speech, environmental survival? I mean, these are often now being treated as radical leftist ideas, which is crazy. It seems to me that human rights should be as neutral as you can get, as attackable as you can get. So I'm wondering if there is a sort of a moral stance that you think that journalists should be taking.
I mean, for me, the stance is um, really like allegiance to a vision for collective liberation, to the belief that it's possible for us to uh, live in a world where exploitation, marginalization, and violence are not the norm, and an allegiance to um, telling stories that make that world more likely, more possible. And I think that can look a lot of ways, but that's more or less what it is for me.
Yeah, I love that. Um, So I think, I mean, to me, one of the purposes of the conversation that we're having for the people on the call and the people who will view this later is to be critical, critical thinking, really, when you read um, any news story, to be aware of the frame from which that writer or that reporter is coming, or the media outlet from which it is coming. So being able to sort of gauge, I can see this is being written from a white perspective, or somebody who, as you said, has not experienced flooding in the south side of Chicago, or somebody who is not seeing. I mean, to me, you go through life in a frame, and that frame are all the events that have shaped you, your family, your school, everything. But whatever is outside of your experience is outside of your frame, because you don't know what you are not seeing. So I wonder if you can talk about being able to discern, as you read a story, what the perspective is and how to maybe adjust for that.
So I look at the issue that I brought up before of news judgment. What's the sort of fundamental question being asked? Um, that's driving the whole topic of the story. What voices are included, and then who else might be connected to this that isn't included.
Mhm.
So, the New York Times has a fine tradition of doing stories about trans people where there are no trans people quoted in the story. That's a tell. That's a way to tell.
Uh-huh.
Uh, just pay attention to that. Who is quoted, and then, yeah, the critical thinking piece is then using your creative mind to imagine. And this is the same work as the work of a good journalist. Who else might be connected to this that we should talk to?
Mhm.
Who else could we have talked to? Um, Looking at numbers and data critically, where did those come from? um, yeah, what are the sources of those numbers? A lot of news reporting about police and crime really uncritically uses data supplied by the police to talk about what the police are doing. So that's another example of a bias that is towards police that's so normalized in news reporting, it goes really unquestioned. Um, I think those are the main things. I don't think there's really a be all end all to that, but that's kind of where I would start.
Mhm. So you have a new book. When is it coming out, first of all? Your new book.
It's coming out on October 28th,
Oh.
so really soon. It's going to be a little Scorpio baby. And I love to share. So the book is called Radical Unlearning, the
Mhm.
Art and Science of Creating Change from Within. And it's in some ways a follow-up and in some ways a really big departure from my first book, which was really a history of journalism. Radical Unlearning asks the question, what creates the conditions for us to let go of deeply held beliefs and ideologies? And it starts and ends with the story of my grandmother, who was born and raised, Sarah McCrory, whose birthday was September 30th, so just a couple days ago. She was born and raised in Columbia, South Carolina, and grew up in a really racist and sexist society. And not even homophobic, because they hadn't even heard of that when she
Mhm.
was young. And uh, as she moved through her life, she became more and more aware of racism. She became aware of homophobia, of the existence of gay people, and then of homophobia. Um, And she became aware of me, this young trans queer person who was descended from her. And she tried very late into her life to let go of some of the negative reactions that she had to me being trans, um, to racially integrated spaces, these things that she knew it was wrong. She knew she didn't want to feel that way, but the biases were so deeply ingrained in her that she had real cognitive dissonance. She really struggled. She was anti-racist, right? But inside of her, she was grappling with a lot of racism. And I would say the same thing about homophobia and transphobia. And so this story starts with my interviews that I did when she was 95, 96, before she died, with her, about her process of trying to unlearn and how incomplete and it was and how ambiguous it was, but how the point to me was that she tried. And that inspires me and inspired me to do a whole book about people who have unlearned in sort of a daily way. Like, what's the thing that is creating cognitive dissonance in me that I want to address, and how can I unlearn that? And then how can I create spaces and conditions for people around me to experience the same kind of transformation that can actually be really liberating.
That's really interesting. How far did she get on that journey?
From where she came, I think she came very far.
Hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, I'll really look forward to reading that. I think we're sort of coming to the end of the hour, and I know you're in North Carolina, so I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you giving us this time so late for you. And I've seen a lot of appreciation in the chat. And one of the things you said that I love so much is that we can make a difference in the news, because that is what our group, our organization is all about, is sort of encouraging people to feel their personal agency, to make change, to make, as you said, make the world that you want to live in. So I think that that is very empowering to people. So are there any final words that you'd like to leave us with?
I think that for me, the core of what I wrote about in Radical Unlearning, and also the core of kind of the power that we have in this political moment where we're dealing with such kind of overwhelming forces, and hostile forces of authoritarianism and racism and transphobia, the thing that we have so much power over is community, and not community in kind of the soft or passive sense, but community in the sense of actively building community and connecting with one another in ways that are meaningful and transformative. And so I think, even on the worst days, the fact that we can come together and like talk about ideas and change each other's minds, or the fact that we can come together and um, support people whose resources have been systematically taken away by the state. These are things that people in oppressed communities have always done and will always do, mutual aid and political consciousness raising, political education. And I think we're in a moment where that's what we should focus on, because it's what we can do, and it leads to actually the strong kind of power, not the kind of power that's top down, right? But the kind of power that's from the bottom up. And I think that really is what you all are doing with these gatherings, and the vision that you have of civic engagement beyond voting is such a great example of that. But that's where I am all the time, every day, is like, what can we do? Okay, here's what we can always do, is support one another through these moments of crisis, and support one another in risk taking kind of boundary stretching ways, right?
Yeah.
Like really extend ourselves to be part of a community that is radical in our resistance to this toxic individualism and destructive kind of hierarchical thinking that we're all being faced with, and that a lot of people have been faced with intergenerationally, right? And so also
Mhm.
really looking to those kind of traditions of survival from marginalized people.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, community building is definitely a huge part of what we try to do. Um, and I think it not only allows people to support each other, but to learn about each other and thereby to stretch your understanding of other people's perspective in the world. And I think that is something we can't do enough of. So I think that is wonderful, and thank you so much for those words. So yeah, and toxic individualism. Yes, that is a very great term. Um, so Lewis, I will let you go. I am so happy we have had this conversation. I so appreciate you taking the time. Do you want to say, oh, just a word about your office hours? Because that is something that people are invited to.
Yeah, so I have free open to the public office hours at Interrupting Criminalization, which is the organization where I work, founded by Miriam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie. It's for journalists, media makers, and also anyone who's dealing with journalism or media strategy kind of issues and questions towards ending criminalization. So feel free to sign up for one if you want to come talk to me about any of that. There's more information there, or send it to people. I get a lot of calls lately that are on the media strategy side of like, how do we get our stories out? How do we reach journalists? And I can't always answer that, but I can try. So
Mhm. Great. Well, thank you so much for writing what you're writing, for doing what you're doing, and for living the life that you're living. So I think this has been a beautiful conversation. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined. I know there's been a lot of appreciation and love and enjoyment in the chat. So thank you so much, Lewis, and we'll hope to talk to you again.
thank you for having me.
Okay, bye.